There is a photograph that has lived in the memory of Canadian hockey for more than 2 decades now. It shows a boy, maybe 5 years old, standing in the basement of a modest house in Cole Harbour, Nova Scotia. He is wearing a pair of oversized hockey gloves. His stick is almost as tall as he is. Behind him, the dryer is dented, the washing machine too. Every square inch of drywall carries the scars of 10,000 shots, taken before dinner, taken after school, taken during the quiet hours when the rest of the neighborhood had gone to sleep. That boy's name was Sidney Crosby, and one day the entire hockey world would bend around him. Cole Harbour sits on the eastern edge of Halifax, a quiet community where the winters are long and the ice freezes deep. It is the kind of place where fathers drive their sons to the rink before dawn, and mothers wrap tape around sticks that have been broken and repaired so many times they barely hold together. It is the kind of place where dreams begin slowly, carried on the cold wind off the Atlantic, nurtured in small arenas that smell of rubber and sweat and Zamboni exhaust. The houses are close together, the yards are small, the people work hard and expect nothing to be given. This is the soil from which Sidney Crosby grew. This is the place that shaped his character before the game shaped his fame. He learned to skate on those frozen surfaces, wobbling at first, then gliding, then flying. He learned to shoot in that basement, the rhythmic crack of composite on vulcanized rubber echoing up through the floor while his parents watched television in the room above. He learned to compete against boys 2 and 3 years older, absorbing hits from bodies twice his size, falling down, getting up, falling again, getting up again, until the falling stopped and the getting up became all that remained. He was relentless in a way that went beyond ambition. It was something deeper, something that lived in the marrow. What followed over the next 2 decades is one of the most remarkable careers in the history of professional sports. A career that would include 3 Stanley Cup championships, 2 Conn Smythe trophies as the most valuable player of the playoffs, 2 Hart Memorial trophies as the league's most valuable player, 2 Art Ross trophies as the league's leading scorer, a Rocket Richard trophy for leading the league in goals, Olympic gold medals won on home soil with a goal that became part of a nation's mythology, and through it all, a consistency of excellence that defied every injury, every setback, every moment when the body said stop and the mind said keep going. But the numbers alone do not tell the full story. They never do with the great ones. The full story lives in the details that statistics cannot capture. It lives in the concussions that stole years from his prime and left questions about his future that had no easy answers. It lives in the quiet way he led, never shouting from the rooftops, never demanding the spotlight or the microphone, simply playing with a ferocity and intelligence that made everyone around him better and everyone across from him worse. It lives in the way he taped his sticks, the same pattern every time, the same ritual performed thousands of times over 2 decades. It lives in the way he studied film, breaking down opponents frame by frame, searching for the smallest edge. It lives in the way he arrived at the arena hours before anyone else, and stayed long after the lights were dimmed and the Zamboni had finished its final pass. The full story lives in the gap between the public image and the private man, between the legend and the human being who created it with his hands and his heart and his willingness to endure. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand not just what Sidney Crosby accomplished, but what it cost him to accomplish it. You are going to understand how a boy from a small town in Nova Scotia became the most complete hockey player of his generation, perhaps the most complete of any generation. And you are going to understand why, even now, even as the years have passed and new stars have emerged and the game has evolved in ways that Crosby himself helped set in motion, the name Crosby still carries a weight in hockey that very few names ever will. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let's begin. To understand what Sidney Crosby means to hockey, you first have to understand what the Stanley Cup means to hockey, because in no other major professional sport does a single trophy carry so much history, so much weight, so much raw emotional power. The Vince Lombardi Trophy in football is beautiful, but it is replaced every year, a new one cast for each champion. The Larry O'Brien Trophy in basketball is elegant, but it does not travel with the players, does not sit on their kitchen tables, does not carry the names of every champion who came before. The Stanley Cup is different. The Stanley Cup is alive. It is the oldest professional sports trophy in North America. It is a living artifact, a sacred object that connects the modern game to its deepest roots, that links a player lacing up his skates in a state-of-the-art training facility in the 21st century to a man strapping on leather pads in a frozen barn in 1893. And when Sidney Crosby lifted it above his head for the first time in June of 2009, he was not simply winning a championship. He was adding his name to a story that stretches back more than 130 years, a story written in silver and sweat and the blood of men who gave everything they had to a game played on frozen water. The cup itself was donated in 1893 by Lord Stanley of Preston, who served as the Governor-General of Canada. Lord Stanley had fallen in love with the game of hockey after watching his sons play on the outdoor rinks of Ottawa, and he purchased a decorative punch bowl, a silver chalice that cost roughly $50 at the time, equivalent to perhaps $1,000 today, to be awarded annually to the best amateur hockey team in the Dominion of Canada. That original bowl, modest and unassuming, roughly 7.5 inches tall, could fit in the palm of a man's hand. It looked nothing like the towering trophy we know today, but it carried something that money could not buy. It carried meaning. Over the decades, as the game grew and the competition intensified, bands were added to the base of the cup to accommodate the names of winning players, coaches, and team executives. The cup grew taller. It grew heavier. It evolved from a small silver bowl into a 3-foot monument weighing roughly 35 pounds. The bands were periodically removed and sent to the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto when they were full, replaced by new blank bands waiting to receive new names. In this way, the cup is constantly renewing itself, shedding its oldest layer of history to make room for new chapters while preserving the old ones in the hall for posterity. It is a trophy that breathes. There is a tradition in hockey, unlike anything in any other sport. When a team wins the Stanley Cup, each player on the winning roster is given a personal day with the trophy. Not a ceremony in a ballroom, not a banquet with speeches. A day, 24 hours, more or less, during which the cup belongs to that player. The trophy is brought to his hometown, to his family's kitchen table, to the rink where he first learned to skate, to the places and people that made him who he is. The cup has travelled to mountaintops in the Canadian Rockies and to fishing villages on the coast of Newfoundland. It has been taken to hospital rooms where sick children held it in their small hands and smiled. It has visited military bases and churches and schools and pubs. It has been filled with champagne and with cereal and with baptismal water. It has been dropped off a boat into a swimming pool. It has been left on the side of the road after a celebration that got a little too enthusiastic. It has been dented and scratched and repaired, and every mark on its surface tells a story that belongs not just to one player, but to the entire tradition of the game. This is the tradition that Sidney Crosby entered when he was drafted first overall by the Pittsburgh Penguins in 2005. This is the tradition he would eventually claim as his own, not once but 3 times. The history of the Stanley Cup is, in a very real sense, the history of hockey itself. In the early years of the 20th century, before the National Hockey League even existed, the Cup was contested by amateur and professional teams from across Canada in challenge matches. Any team that believed itself worthy could issue a challenge to the reigning cup holders, and if the challenge was accepted, a series would be played, sometimes in the most unlikely of settings. In 1905, a team from Dawson City, in the Yukon Territory, travelled more than 4,000 miles by dogsled, boat and train to challenge the Ottawa Silver Seven for the Cup. They arrived exhausted, frostbitten, and thoroughly outmatched. Ottawa won the 2-game series by a combined score of 32-4. Frank McGee, Ottawa's star forward, scored 14 goals in a single game, 14 in one game. The numbers from that era seem almost fictional, but they are real, etched into the record books and into the bands of the Cup itself. When the National Hockey League was founded on November 26, 1917, in Montreal, the Cup gradually became the exclusive domain of the new professional league. The founding franchises included the Montreal Canadiens, the Montreal Wanderers, the Ottawa Senators, and the Toronto Arenas. The Wanderers folded after their arena burned down in January of 1918, just weeks into the first season. The league survived, barely, and over the following decades it consolidated and contracted until, by 1942, only 6 teams remained. These 6 teams, the Montreal Canadiens, the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Detroit Red Wings, the Chicago Blackhawks, the Boston Bruins, and the New York Rangers, would comprise the entirety of the NHL for the next 25 years, a period known as the Original Six era. During the Original Six era, from 1942 to 1967, the Stanley Cup was dominated by a small number of dynasties. The Montreal Canadiens were the most successful franchise, winning the Cup an astonishing 10 times during this span, including 5 consecutive championships from 1956 through 1960. That run of 5 straight titles remains the longest in NHL history and may never be matched. The Canadiens' rosters during those years read like an all-star team drawn from a different century. Maurice "Rocket" Richard, the fiery right winger from Montreal, who became the first player to score 50 goals in a single season, achieving the feat in 1945 in just 50 games. Jean Béliveau, the tall, elegant centre whose grace on the ice was matched only by his dignity off it, a man who turned down multiple offers to enter politics because he believed his role was to serve hockey, not government. Doug Harvey, the defenseman whose puck-handling ability and strategic intelligence redefined what a blue liner could do. Jacques Plante, the revolutionary goaltender who changed the position forever by insisting on wearing a protective mask, a decision that was initially met with ridicule and eventually recognized as one of the most important innovations in the history of the sport. The names engraved on the cup during those years form a roll call of hockey immortality. Beyond the Canadiens, there was Gordie Howe of the Detroit Red Wings, the tireless right winger known as Mr. Hockey, who played professional hockey across 5 decades, from the late 1940s through the 1980s, a span of time so vast that it seems almost impossible. Howe won 4 Stanley Cups with Detroit and 6 Hart trophies as the league's most valuable player. His combination of skill and toughness set the standard for what it meant to be a complete hockey player, a standard that would not be equaled until Sidney Crosby arrived half a century later. There was Terry Sawchuk, the tortured goaltender whose body bore the scars of more than 400 stitches received during his career, a man who played in an era before masks and padding were adequate, who stopped pucks with his face and his body and paid for it with a lifetime of pain. These men did not merely play hockey. They built it, they shaped it, they suffered for it, and their names, etched forever on the bands of the cup, serve as a permanent silver reminder of what the game once demanded and what certain men were willing to give. When the NHL expanded in 1967, doubling from 6 teams to 12 in a single year, the Stanley Cup entered a new chapter. Suddenly, the trophy was contested across a wider landscape. New franchises in cities like Philadelphia, Los Angeles, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, and Minnesota brought the game to audiences who had never experienced professional hockey. The Philadelphia Flyers, assembled from scratch through the expansion draft and later fortified by shrewd trades and drafting, won back-to-back cups in 1974 and 1975. Known as the Broad Street Bullies, the Flyers played a style so physically punishing, so deliberately intimidating, that they redefined the boundaries of what was acceptable on the ice. Their captain, Bobby Clarke, was a diabetic centre from Flin Flon, Manitoba, who played with a ferocity that bordered on menace. Their enforcer, Dave Schultz, accumulated more than 400 penalty minutes in a single season. They were loved in Philadelphia and despised everywhere else, and their cups are engraved on the trophy alongside the names of gentlemen and poets. The Montreal Canadiens reasserted their dominance in the late 1970s, winning 4 consecutive championships from 1976 through 1979, a dynasty built on blazing speed, precise passing, and the extraordinary goaltending of Ken Dryden, a Cornell-educated lawyer who played just 8 full seasons in the NHL and won 6 Stanley Cups. Dryden stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and played with a cerebral calm that belied the chaos around him. often resting his chin on his blocker hand at the top of his goal stick during stoppages in play, surveying the arena like a professor observing a laboratory experiment. He retired at 31, at the peak of his abilities, because he had other things he wanted to do with his life. His name is on the cup 6 times. Then came the 1980s, and with them, the Edmonton Oilers. Wayne Gretzky, Mark Messier, Jari Kurri, Paul Coffey, Grant Fuhr, Glenn Anderson. This was a team that did not merely win hockey games. It redefined the sport. The Oilers played an offensive style so explosive, so fast, so breathtakingly creative, that it changed the way hockey was understood and coached at every level. Gretzky himself became the most prolific scorer in the history of the sport, accumulating records that seem less like statistics and more like typographical errors. He scored 92 goals in the 1981-82 season. He recorded 215 points in the 1985-86 season. He finished his career with 2,857 points, nearly 1,000 more than anyone else who has ever played the game. The Oilers won 5 Stanley Cups in 7 years, and when Gretzky lifted the trophy, when his name was engraved on its bands, it joined a lineage that stretched back through Béliveau and Richard and Howe all the way to Lord Stanley's original gift. The 1990s brought another set of dynasties and dramatic moments. The New York Rangers ended a 54-year championship drought in 1994, winning the cup in a dramatic 7-game final against the Vancouver Canucks, with Mark Messier, who had already won 5 cups in Edmonton, providing the leadership and the guarantee, a famous moment in which he publicly predicted a Game 6 victory in the Eastern Conference Finals against the New Jersey Devils, and then delivered on that promise with a hat trick. The Detroit Red Wings, rebuilt by general manager Jim Devellano and coached by Scotty Bowman, the winningest coach in NHL history, won 3 cups in 6 years between 1997 and 2002. Their roster was a masterwork of talent and experience, featuring Steve Yzerman, Nicholas Lidstrom, Sergei Fedorov, Brendan Shanahan, Chris Chelios, and others. The New Jersey Devils, under coach Jacques Lemaire, brought the neutral-zoned trap to prominence and won 3 cups of their own, proving that defensive systems could be just as effective as offensive brilliance. Each of these victories added names to the cup, added chapters to its story, added weight to the tradition that every player who enters the NHL eventually confronts. And then came the early 2000s, and the crisis. The game was slowing down, scoring was declining, the neutral zone trap and clutch and grab hockey were choking the creativity out of the sport. Attendance in some markets was falling, television ratings were stagnant, and in September of 2004, the owners locked out the players in a labor dispute centered on the implementation of a salary cap. The lockout lasted 310 days. The entire 2004 to 2005 season was cancelled, for the first time since 1919, when a flu epidemic forced the cancellation of the Stanley Cup final between the Montreal Canadiens and the Seattle Metropolitans. There was no champion. The cup sat in the Hockey Hall of Fame, unclaimed, gathering a kind of dust that was not physical but spiritual. When the lockout ended and the league returned for the 2005 to 2006 season, the NHL needed a savior. It needed a face, a story, a player who could reignite the passion of a fan base that had been alienated and ignored. It needed someone young enough to represent the future and talented enough to deliver on the promise. It needed someone who could carry the weight of an entire league's rehabilitation. And waiting in the wings, just 18 years old, already famous, already burdened, was Sidney Crosby. The Pittsburgh Penguins were in many ways the perfect destination. The franchise had its own deep, complicated connection to the Stanley Cup tradition. Mario Lemieux, widely regarded as one of the 2 or 3 most gifted players in the history of the sport, had led the Penguins to back-to-back Stanley Cup championships in 1991 and 1992. Lemieux was so extraordinarily talented that many who watched him play believed he possessed abilities that Gretzky himself did not have, a size and reach and shot that made him virtually unstoppable when healthy. But Lemieux was rarely healthy. He battled chronic back pain throughout his career. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin lymphoma during the 1992-93 season, undergoing radiation treatments in the morning and playing games at night, missing 2 months, and then returning to win the scoring title. He retired in 1997, came back in 2000, retired again in 2006, and in between, he purchased the Penguins franchise out of bankruptcy, saving it from relocation to Kansas City or Portland or some other city that would never have appreciated what it had. When Crosby arrived in Pittsburgh, Lemieux was the team's owner and its spiritual father, and in a gesture that said everything about the passing of a torch from one era to the next, Lemieux invited the 18-year-old rookie to live in his home. Crosby moved into a spare bedroom in the house of one of the greatest players who had ever lived. He ate dinner with the Lemieux family. He played basement hockey with Lemieux's children. He absorbed, through proximity and osmosis, the culture of excellence that Lemieux had built, and the expectations that came with wearing the Penguin sweater, the tradition of the Stanley Cup, the weight of Pittsburgh hockey history, the ghost of Lemieux's own brilliance. All of it settled around Crosby like snowfall, quiet and heavy and impossible to ignore. The cup has a custodian, a keeper who travels with it wherever it goes, watching over it with the devotion of a guardian. For decades, this role has been filled by men from the Hockey Hall of Fame who understand the trophy's significance and treat it with a reverence that borders on the sacred. The keeper accompanies the cup to victory celebrations and to charity events, to parades through city streets, and to private moments in living rooms. He ensures that the trophy is treated with respect, even during the most exuberant celebrations. He has stories that could fill a book, stories of players who wept when they held it, stories of children who touched it with wide eyes, stories of the cup arriving in small towns where the entire population turned out to see it. There is a superstition in hockey, deeply held and almost universally observed. A player should never touch the Stanley Cup until he has earned the right to lift it as a champion. Young players are warned, often by older teammates who have themselves never touched it, not to reach out, not to pose with it, not to tempt fate by presuming that it will be theirs. This superstition speaks to something essential about hockey culture. It speaks to a belief that the cup is not a prize to be claimed, but a trial to be survived. It must be earned through sacrifice, through pain, through the grinding, exhausting, beautiful ordeal of a playoff run that can stretch across 2 months and require 16 victories in as many as 28 games. No other major sport demands this. No other trophy asks this much of the men who seek it. Sidney Crosby understood all of this. He understood it instinctively, the way a child raised in hockey country understands the importance of the game before anyone has to explain it. He understood that lifting the cup would mean something beyond personal achievement. It would mean joining a fraternity of champions that stretch back over a century. It would mean adding his name to the same surface that bore the names of Richard and Béliveau and Howe and Gretzky and Lemieux. And he understood that failing to lift it, that falling short, would define his career just as clearly as success would. The Stanley Cup does not care about potential. It does not care about draft position or marketing campaigns. It cares only about what happens on the ice, in the moments when the pressure is highest, and the margin for error is thinnest, and the body is screaming for rest that will not come. This is the tradition that Crosby entered. This is the standard he was measured against. And this is the story that his career, from its brilliant beginning to its hard-earned triumphs, would ultimately tell. And it is worth pausing here to consider the physical reality of what the Stanley Cup playoffs demand. In the regular season, NHL teams play 82 games over roughly 7 months. The schedule is grueling, with travel across 4 time zones, back-to-back games, and the inevitable accumulation of injuries, both seen and hidden. But the regular season is merely a qualifying round, a prelude to the real test. The playoffs begin in April and can stretch into late June. To win the Cup, a team must win 4 best-of-7 series, requiring a minimum of 16 victories and as many as 28 games. The intensity of playoff hockey is qualitatively different from the regular season. The checking is harder, the skating is faster, the officiating is looser, and the consequences of every mistake are magnified by the knowledge that elimination is always one loss away. The physical toll is enormous. Players routinely play through injuries in the playoffs that would sideline them during the regular season. Broken bones, torn ligaments, separated shoulders, cracked ribs, these are not hypothetical dangers. They are the documented reality of postseason hockey. Players receive injections of painkillers before games. They receive stitches between periods and return for the next shift. They play with equipment that has been modified to accommodate injuries that would send ordinary people to the hospital, and they do this willingly, even eagerly, because the Stanley Cup is the prize that justifies every sacrifice. The emotional toll is equally significant but less visible. The pressure of the playoffs, the knowledge that an entire season's work can be undone by a single bad bounce, a single missed assignment, a single moment of lost concentration, weighs on players in ways that they rarely discuss publicly. Sleep becomes difficult, appetite fluctuates, relationships strain under the weight of the competition and the isolation that comes with total commitment to a single goal. Teams that win the cup often describe the experience in language that borders on the spiritual, as if the ordeal of the playoffs had stripped them down to their essential selves, and then rebuilt them into something they had not known they could be. This is the tradition that Sidney Crosby understood instinctively, the tradition he had been raised to reverence. The Stanley Cup is not won by the most talented team. It is won by the team that endures. And endurance, more than speed or strength or skill, was the quality that defined Crosby's career from beginning to end. He endured the scrutiny, he endured the injuries, he endured the pressure, and in the end, he endured long enough to lift the cup 3 times and engrave his name among the immortals. The cup has witnessed moments of transcendence that have become permanent fixtures in hockey's collective memory. Bobby Orr, the Boston Bruins defenseman, who redefined the position, flying through the air after scoring the overtime goal that won the 1970 championship, his body parallel to the ice, his arms outstretched, captured in a photograph that became the most iconic image in hockey history. Ray Bourque, the great Boston defenseman who spent 21 seasons with the Bruins without winning a championship, traded to the Colorado Avalanche in his final season, finally lifting the cup at age 40 in 2001, tears streaming down his face, the culmination of a career spent in pursuit of the one achievement that had always eluded him. His captain, Joe Sakic, received the cup from the league commissioner and immediately handed it to Bourque, a gesture of generosity and respect that defined what the trophy meant to the men who sought it. These moments are not merely entertaining. They are instructive. They teach us what the Stanley Cup demands and what it gives. They show us that the cup is not won by the most talented team, but by the team that wants it most, that sacrifices most, that endures the most pain and disappointment on the road to triumph. They show us that individual brilliance is necessary but insufficient, that champions are made by collectives, by groups of men who subordinate their individual desires to a common purpose. And they show us that the moment of lifting the cup, the moment when the captain raises it above his head, and the crowd erupts, and the weight of the season falls away, is unlike anything else in professional sports, a catharsis that erases every bruise, every loss, every sleepless night of the preceding months. The lockout of 2004 to 2005 was not merely a labour dispute. It was an existential crisis for a league that had spent decades struggling for mainstream recognition in the United States. Entire seasons of momentum were lost. Television contracts hung in the balance. Fans in non-traditional markets drifted away, their attention captured by other sports that had not asked them to wait. When the games finally resumed, the NHL needed more than a new collective bargaining agreement. It needed a face, a narrative, a reason for casual fans to care again. It needed someone who could carry the weight of an entire sport's ambitions on his shoulders while still being young enough to grow into them. The salary cap, introduced as part of the new agreement, would reshape the competitive landscape. But no structural reform could replace the human element, the story that would make people tune in. That story was about to arrive from a small town on the Atlantic coast, wearing number 87 and carrying expectations that would have crushed anyone less prepared. When the Penguins won the draft lottery in 2005, The reverberations were felt across the entire league. This was not simply a franchise winning the right to select a talented player. This was the sport itself being handed a lifeline. Pittsburgh, a city with a deep hockey tradition, but a franchise teetering on the brink of relocation, would now become the center of the hockey universe. The symmetry was almost too perfect. Mario Lemieux had saved the franchise once before, both as a player and as an owner. Now, with Crosby's arrival, the cycle of salvation would begin again. Sidney Patrick Crosby was born on August 7th, 1987, in the Grace Maternity Hospital in Halifax, Nova Scotia. His father, Troy Crosby, had been a promising hockey player himself, a goaltender drafted by the Montreal Canadiens in the 1984 NHL entry draft, 240th overall in the 12th round. Troy had the talent but not the fortune. He played in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League for the Verdun Junior Canadiens, backstopping games in arenas with bad lighting and worse heat, dreaming of a call-up to the big league that never came. He spent time in minor professional leagues, the East Coast Hockey League and its equivalent circuits, playing in front of crowds that sometimes numbered in the hundreds. And then, as happens to so many promising athletes, the dream ended quietly, without ceremony, and Troy came home. He returned to Nova Scotia. He married Trina Forbes, a woman from the same community who understood what hockey meant and what it demanded. They settled in Cole Harbour, a suburban neighbourhood on the eastern shore of Halifax Harbour, and they started a family. Sidney was the first child. His sister, Taylor, came later and would eventually become a standout hockey player in her own right, competing at the college level in the United States. Troy Crosby understood, with the clarity that only comes from personal experience, what it took to reach the highest levels of hockey and how painfully narrow the gap was between making it and falling short. He had lived on the wrong side of that gap. He had felt the game's promise and then felt it slip through his fingers like meltwater. And so when his son began to show an interest in hockey, an interest that manifested early and with an intensity that surprised even Troy, the father did not simply encourage the boy. He built an environment designed to produce greatness, not deliberately perhaps, not with a blueprint or a plan, but with the intuition of a man who knew the game from the inside, who knew where it hurt and where it rewarded, and who saw in his son something that he recognized from his own best days on the ice. The basement of the Crosby home in Cole Harbour became a training facility of sorts. Troy cleared the space, set up a net, and allowed Sidney to shoot pucks by the hundreds. The dryer absorbed the punishment. Its metal surface became a canvas of dents, each one representing a shot fired by a boy who was not yet tall enough to see over the dasher boards at the local rink. The washing machine bore similar scars. The drywall was not spared. Puck marks decorated the walls like strange art, evidence of a childhood spent in relentless, joyful, obsessive pursuit of a single goal. Hit the target, hit it again, hit it from the left, hit it from the right, hit it high, hit it low, do it again and again and again. By the time he was 2 years old, Sidney was on skates. This is not unusual in hockey families in the Maritimes, where children learn to skate almost as soon as they learn to walk. But what was unusual was the speed of his development. By 3, he was playing organised hockey in local leagues. By 5, he was competing against children 2 and 3 years older than him, not merely holding his own but dominating in a way that made adults stop what they were doing and watch. The reports from those early years, preserved in newspaper clippings and in the memories of coaches and parents who were there, describe a child who was not simply talented but possessed by the game. He did not play hockey the way other children did, as a diversion, as entertainment, as one activity among many. He played it with a focus and an intensity that startled the adults around him and sometimes unnerved the children he played against. He would practice his shot until his hands were blistered and raw. He would skate until his legs burned and then skate some more. He would watch hockey on television with a concentration that went beyond fandom. He was studying. Even at 5 and 6 years old, he was watching how professional players moved, how they positioned themselves, how they handled the puck in traffic, and released their shots from impossible angles. He was absorbing the game at a level that most children do not reach until adolescence, if they reach it at all. His father was his first coach, his most demanding critic, and his most devoted supporter, and the line between those roles was not always clear. Troy pushed Sidney hard. Some observers would later say he pushed too hard, that the intensity of the training bordered on excessive for a child so young. The relationship between father and son in competitive hockey is a complicated landscape, layered with ambition and love, and the knowledge that the window for development is narrow and unforgiving. Troy saw something in Sidney that he recognized from his own playing days, a hunger that could not be satisfied by ordinary effort, a refusal to accept anything less than perfection, and he fed that hunger with structure, with discipline, with thousands of hours of deliberate practice that transformed natural ability into something more refined, more dangerous, more complete. By the time Sidney was 7, he was being written about in local newspapers. The stories were brief, tucked into the sports sections of Halifax dailies, but they carried a note of astonishment. A 7-year-old was dominating leagues designed for children years older. By 9, he had been featured on a Canadian television broadcast, a segment that introduced the country to the small boy from Cole Harbour who could do things with a puck that grown men struggled to replicate. By 11, he was scoring at a pace that had no precedent in Nova Scotia minor hockey. By 13, he was making national headlines. In one particularly extraordinary season of minor hockey, he scored 159 goals in 55 games. 159 goals in 55 games. He added 162 assists for 321 points. The numbers were not merely impressive, they were absurd. They belonged to a video game, not to reality. And yet they were real, verified by score sheets and game reports, and the testimony of every coach and parent who watched him play. The word that kept appearing in the coverage was prodigy, but that word, for all its weight, did not capture the full picture. A prodigy is gifted. Sidney Crosby was gifted and relentless. The gift was obvious to anyone who watched him skate for 30 seconds. The relentlessness was what separated him from every other gifted child in every other rink, in every other province. He outworked his talent. He outprepared his peers. He refused to coast on ability when effort could make the ability sharper, more precise, more devastating. This combination, the natural gift and the unnatural work ethic, was the engine that would drive the rest of his life. At 14, he made a decision that would shape the trajectory of everything that followed. He left Cole Harbour. He enrolled at Shattuck St. Mary's, a preparatory school in Faribault, Minnesota, a small town about an hour south of Minneapolis, that had become one of the premier development programs for elite hockey talent in North America. The school had produced NHL players before and would produce more after, but none quite like Crosby. It was a difficult choice for a boy who was still, in many fundamental ways, just a boy. He was leaving his family, his friends, his community. He was crossing the border into a country that was not his own, leaving behind the familiar rhythms of Nova Scotia life for the flatlands of the American Midwest, and he was doing it because the competition at home was no longer sufficient. He had outgrown it. He needed to be challenged by players closer to his level, needed to test himself against the best young talent available, needed to grow in ways that Cole Harbour could no longer facilitate. At Shattuck St. Mary's, Crosby thrived with an ease that was almost unsettling. He scored 72 goals and added 90 assists for 162 points in 57 games during the 2002 to 2003 season. He was named the top high school hockey player in the United States, a distinction that carried irony given that he was a Canadian who had been in the country for less than a year. He was already drawing the attention of NHL scouts, professional evaluators who made the trip to rural Minnesota to watch a 15-year-old play against other teenagers and came away with scouting reports that used words like generational and franchise-altering and once in a lifetime. After 1 year in Minnesota, Crosby returned to Canada. He was selected first overall by the Rimouski Oceanic of the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, known colloquially as the Q. Rimouski is a small city on the south shore of the St. Lawrence River in the province of Quebec, a French-speaking community, far from the English-speaking world that Crosby had known. He would spend 2 seasons there, And those 2 seasons would transform him from a highly touted prospect into an undeniable phenomenon, a player whose talent was so evident and so overwhelming that the debate was no longer about whether he was good enough for the NHL, but about how quickly the NHL could get him. His first season with the Oceanic, 2003 to 2004, was a masterclass in precocity. He scored 54 goals and added 81 assists for 135 points in 62 games. He was 16 years old, playing against opponents who were 18, 19 and 20. Some of them physically mature men who had been shaving for years. He won the Canadian Hockey League Rookie of the Year award. He was named to the QMJHL First All-Star Team. He was the youngest player ever to represent Canada at the World Junior Ice Hockey Championships, and he acquitted himself with distinction on that stage as well. And then, in his second season with Rimouski, 2004 to 2005, he reached a level that defied rational analysis. He scored 66 goals. He added 102 assists, 168 points in 62 games. He averaged more than 2.7 per game. He was 17 years old, and he was not just the best player in the QMJHL. He was arguably the best player in any league outside the NHL, and some suggested he might already be the best player in the world if given the chance to prove it. And it gets harder, because with all of this attention, all of this scrutiny, all of this expectation, came a pressure that no teenager should have to bear alone. Crosby was being called the Next One, a reference to Gretzky's famous nickname of the Great One. The comparison was flattering in theory and crushing in practice. Every game he played was analysed by national media. Every shift was dissected. Opposing fans taunted him. Opposing players targeted him, seeking to make a reputation by hurting the boy everyone was talking about. He was slashed and cross-checked and elbowed with a frequency that crossed the line from competitive hockey into something uglier. He played through it all with a stoicism that masked the toll, physical and emotional, that it was taking. His bilingual situation in Rimouski added another layer of challenge. Crosby had grown up speaking English. His French was limited when he arrived. He was immersed in a community and a league where French was the primary language, and he had to navigate not just the demands of elite hockey, but the isolation that comes with living in a culture and a language that are not your own. He learned French. He connected with his teammates. He made Rimouski his second home. But the adjustment was real, and it happened at the same time that the hockey world was placing him under a microscope that no teenager should have to endure. In May of 2005, Crosby led Rimouski to the Memorial Cup tournament, the championship event of Canadian junior hockey, held that year in London, Ontario. The Oceanic advanced to the final, where they faced the London Knights, the host team, in front of a crowd that was overwhelmingly hostile. Crosby played brilliantly, as he always did, but Rimouski lost. It was a heartbreaking conclusion to his junior career, a defeat that stung because it denied him the one championship that he had not yet won at that level, but it would be the last time Sidney Crosby would play junior hockey. The NHL was calling, and its voice was impossible to ignore. The 2005 NHL entry draft was unlike any draft the league had ever conducted. The entire previous season had been lost to the lockout, a work stoppage that had lasted from September of 2004 through July of 2005, when the league and the Players Association finally reached an agreement. The NHL implemented a salary cap for the first time, along with a new set of rules designed to open up the game and increase scoring. The crackdown on hooking, holding, and obstruction would change the way hockey was played, and the draft lottery for the first overall pick was weighted in a way that gave every team, regardless of its record in the last completed season, a chance at selecting Crosby. The lottery was necessary because the league wanted to prevent teams from deliberately losing games to secure the top pick, a practice known as tanking that had become an open secret. The Pittsburgh Penguins won the lottery, and on July 30th, 2005, at the Westin Hotel in Ottawa, Sidney Crosby became a Penguin. He walked to the stage in a dark suit, his smile betraying a mix of excitement and nervousness, and he shook hands with the men who would oversee his career. He was 18 years old. He had been preparing for this moment since the basement, since the dryer, since the first time His father strapped skates on his small feet and pushed him onto the ice. But here's what makes this story unforgettable. It is not the talent alone, and it is not the fame alone, and it is not the pressure alone. It is all of these things together, pressing down on a young man who refused to bend. The cultural impact of the lockout season on Crosby's draft year cannot be overstated. The NHL had been dark for an entire year. Arenas sat empty. Players scattered to European leagues or to the American Hockey League to maintain their conditioning. Fans, betrayed by what they perceived as greed on both sides of the labor dispute, turned their attention to other sports and other pastimes. The league's television deal in the United States, never robust to begin with, was in jeopardy. There was genuine concern, not just among media observers, but within the league's own front offices, that the NHL might never fully recover its audience. Into this environment of uncertainty and disillusionment stepped Sidney Crosby, and the contrast between the league's institutional crisis and the young man's individual promise could not have been sharper. The NHL needed hope, and Crosby was hope personified. He was young and talented and marketable in a way that transcended the sport's traditional boundaries. He was bilingual, comfortable in both English and French, a valuable asset in a league with a significant francophone fan base. He was photogenic, articulate when he needed to be, and possessed of a work ethic that appealed to the blue-collar sensibilities of hockey's core audience. The league's marketing department recognized what it had in Crosby and began to build campaigns around him before he had played a single NHL game. His first training camp with the Penguins was a media circus by hockey standards. Dozens of journalists from Canada and the United States descended on Pittsburgh to chronicle the arrival of the sport's anointed savior. Television cameras followed him through drills. Reporters analyzed his every comment. The pressure was extraordinary, but Crosby handled it with a poise that belied his age. He had been dealing with media attention since he was a teenager. He knew how to answer questions without revealing too much. He knew how to smile for the cameras without losing focus on the work that needed to be done. He was, in many ways, more prepared for the spotlight than any 18-year-old had a right to be. The Penguins' locker room in 2005 was a mixture of young talent and veteran experience, though it leaned heavily toward the former. The team was in the midst of a rebuild, having suffered through several poor seasons that had earned them high draft picks. Crosby joined a roster that included Fleury in goal, a handful of promising young forwards, and a core of older players who were there to provide mentorship and stability. The coaching staff, led by head coach Ed Olczyk and later Michel Therrien, understood that the team was not going to compete for a championship immediately. The goal was development, growth, and the gradual construction of a contender around the extraordinary young centre who now wore the number 87. Crosby chose that number deliberately. 8 for the month of his birth, August the 8th month. 7 for the day, the 7th. 87 for the year 1987. It was a small, personal detail, the kind of quiet self-expression that reveals something about the man behind the player. The number would become iconic, synonymous with Crosby himself, recognized by hockey fans around the world. The relationship between Crosby and his father, Troy, evolved as Sidney's career progressed from childhood prodigy to professional superstar. In the early years, Troy was the architect of Sidney's development, the man who built the training environment, who drove to the rinks, who provided the discipline and the structure that allowed natural talent to flourish. But as Sidney entered the professional ranks, the dynamic necessarily shifted. Troy could no longer coach his son in any meaningful sense. The game at the NHL level was beyond the reach of his own playing experience. His role became more supportive, more observational, a father watching his son navigate challenges that he himself had never faced. Troy has spoken in interviews about the difficulty of watching Sidney endure the concussions, the frustration of being unable to help, the fear that every parent feels when their child is hurt and the treatment is uncertain. He has also spoken about the pride, the deep, uncomplicated pride of seeing a child achieve more than you ever imagined possible, of watching your son lift the Stanley Cup and knowing that you played a small part in making that moment happen. The Crosby family dynamic is, in many ways, the story of hockey families everywhere, amplified to an extraordinary degree by the scale of Sidney's talent and the magnitude of his achievements. Troy's own unfulfilled hockey career added a bittersweet dimension to the narrative. He had been drafted by the Canadiens but never played a game in the NHL. He had come within sight of the dream and been denied, and then he watched his son not merely reach the dream, but surpass it in ways that he could never have anticipated. There is something beautiful and something painful in this dynamic. The knowledge that the son achieved what the father could not, that the torch was passed and carried farther than the original bearer ever imagined. It is a story as old as sport itself, the story of aspiration and generational legacy, and the mysterious alchemy by which talent and opportunity combine to produce greatness. The decision to leave home at 14 was difficult, not just for Sidney, but for the entire family. Trina, his mother, has described the experience of watching her teenager pack his bags and leave for a boarding school in another country as one of the hardest moments of her life. She trusted the decision because she trusted Sidney's judgment, and because she understood, as any hockey parent in Canada understands, that development sometimes requires distance, that a boy cannot grow into a man while still sleeping in his childhood bedroom. But understanding does not eliminate the heartache, and the Crosby family's willingness to sacrifice proximity for potential is a testament to their collective commitment to Sidney's dream. The cultural impact of the lockout season on Crosby's draft year cannot be overstated. For an entire year, the hockey world had nothing to watch, nothing to debate, nothing to celebrate. And so it turned its full attention to the junior leagues, to the prospect rankings, to the question of who would be selected first overall when the NHL returned. That question had only one answer, and everyone knew it. Sidney Crosby was the consensus #1 pick from the moment the lockout began, and the anticipation only grew with each passing month. Into this environment of uncertainty and disillusionment stepped Sidney Crosby, and the weight of expectation was staggering. He was not merely expected to be a good player, he was expected to save the sport. Commentators called him the next one, a reference to Wayne Gretzky's title as the Great One. Marketing departments began planning campaigns around him before he had played a single professional shift. The pressure was immense, and it was public, and it was relentless. His first training camp with the Penguins was a media circus by NHL standards. Reporters who had never covered hockey showed up to chronicle the arrival of the sport's supposed savior. Camera crews followed his every move. Every drill was analyzed, every interaction scrutinized. And through it all, Crosby maintained a composure that seemed impossible for someone who had just turned 18. The Penguins' locker room in 2005 was a mixture of hope and hard-earned skepticism. Veterans like Mark Recchi and John Leclerc had seen prodigies come and go. They knew that the distance between potential and production was measured not in talent, but in will, in the ability to absorb punishment and disappointment, and still show up the next day ready to compete. What they saw in Crosby surprised them. He was not merely talented, he was obsessive, a perfectionist who treated every practice like a playoff game and every mistake like a personal failure. Crosby chose the number 87 deliberately. 8 for the month of his birth, August. 7 for the day, the 7th. 87 for the year, 1987. It was a small detail, but it revealed something essential about his character. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was left to chance. Every element of his professional identity had been considered, weighed, and chosen with intention. This was not a young man who was simply riding his talent. This was someone who understood, even at 18, that greatness was a construction project, built one deliberate decision at a time. He lived with Mario Lemieux during that first year. He ate breakfast at the same table where Lemieux had plotted his own remarkable career. He absorbed the habits and routines of one of the greatest players in history, watching how Lemieux prepared, how he recovered, how he managed the demands of fame and competition. The arrangement was more than a convenience. It was an apprenticeship, a passing of knowledge from one generation of Pittsburgh hockey royalty to the next. Lemieux saw in Crosby the same hunger that had driven his own career, the same refusal to accept anything less than excellence. In his second season, 2006 to 2007, Crosby won the Art Ross Trophy as the league's leading scorer. He was 19 years old, the youngest scoring champion in NHL history. He also won the Hart Trophy as the league's most valuable player and the Lester B. Pearson Award, voted on by the players themselves as the most outstanding player in the league. He was named captain of the Penguins before the start of the following season, becoming the youngest captain in NHL history at 20 years old. The records were piling up, each one another brick in the foundation of what was becoming one of the most remarkable careers the sport had ever seen. The Penguins were growing around him. Evgeny Malkin, a Russian center of extraordinary talent, had arrived the same year as Crosby and was establishing himself as one of the most dangerous offensive players in the game. Marc-Andre Fleury, the goaltender taken first overall in the 2003 draft, was maturing into a reliable presence between the pipes. Jordan Staal, another first-round pick, brought size, speed and versatility to the lineup. The pieces were falling into place, not by accident but by design, and Crosby was the gravitational center around which everything orbited. In the 2007 to 2008 season, the Penguins reached the Stanley Cup final for the first time since 1992. They faced the Detroit Red Wings, one of the most experienced and talented teams in the league. A roster that featured future Hall of Famers Nicklas Lidstrom, Pavel Datsyuk, and Henrik Zetterberg. The Penguins, young and eager, and not yet seasoned enough to handle the pressure of the biggest stage, lost in 6 games. But the defeat was instructive. It taught Crosby and his teammates what it meant to compete at the highest level, what it cost, and what was required to win. He stored those lessons carefully, the way he stored everything, with precision and purpose. The 2008 to 2009 season was the fulfillment of the promise. The Penguins returned to the Stanley Cup final, again facing the Detroit Red Wings, and this time the outcome was different. Pittsburgh won the series in 7 games, clinching the championship on Detroit's home ice. Crosby, at 21 years and 10 months, became the youngest captain in NHL history to hoist the Stanley Cup. The image of him lifting the trophy above his head, his face a mixture of exhaustion and elation, became one of the defining photographs of his generation. The weight of the cup surprised him. He had imagined this moment thousands of times, had rehearsed it in his mind during those endless hours in the Cole Harbour basement. But the reality was different from the fantasy. The trophy was heavier than he expected, both physically and symbolically. It carried the names of every champion who had come before him, and now his name would be added to theirs. The kid from Cole Harbour had become part of hockey's permanent record, but the story of Sidney Crosby's early professional career cannot be told without acknowledging the toll it took on the boy behind the phenomenon. At 18, he was living away from his family for the second time, navigating a new city, a new league, and a level of scrutiny that would have overwhelmed most adults. The media requests alone were exhausting. Every road trip brought a new wave of interview requests. Every game, a new set of cameras tracking his every shift. He developed a routine to manage it, arriving at the rink early enough to complete his preparation before the media descended, answering questions with a politeness that was genuine but also strategic. He understood that managing the narrative was as important as managing his conditioning. One careless quote could dominate the sports pages for days, distracting from the only thing that truly mattered to him, which was the game itself. The physical demands of that first NHL season were unlike anything he had experienced. The speed of the game was faster than junior hockey, the players bigger, the hits harder. Veterans targeted him, testing his resolve the way veterans always test young stars, with slashes behind the play, cross-checks in front of the net, and the occasional cheap shot designed to send a message. Crosby absorbed it all without complaint. He fought back, not with his fists, but with his play, answering every provocation with another goal, another assist, another shift that left defenders grasping at empty air. He finished his rookie season with 102 points, the 6th best rookie season in NHL history. The message was clear. He was not merely surviving at this level, he was thriving. His relationship with Mario Lemieux during those early years provided a stability that was essential to his development. Lemieux understood the pressures that Crosby faced because he had faced them himself, albeit in a different era. He offered advice sparingly, knowing that too much guidance could be as harmful as too little. He modelled the behaviour of a champion without lecturing about it, showing Crosby through daily example what it looked like to carry the weight of a franchise with grace. The mentorship was quiet, almost invisible to outsiders, but its influence on Crosby's character and approach was profound and lasting. The weight of national expectation settled on Crosby's shoulders like snowfall, gradually and then all at once. By the time he was 16, playing for Rimouski in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, his games were regularly broadcast on national television. Scouts from every NHL team attended his shifts, filling notebooks with observations that all reached the same conclusion. This was not merely a talented prospect. This was a generational player, the kind who appears once every 20 or 30 years and redefines what is possible on the ice. The media coverage became a constant companion, a shadow that followed him from rink to rink and city to city, growing longer and darker as the draft approached. The first great crisis of Sidney Crosby's career came not from an opponent's brilliance or a rival's dominance, but from the fragility of the human brain. On January 5, 2011, during the Winter Classic, the NHL's annual outdoor showcase game played that year at Heinz Field in Pittsburgh, before a crowd of nearly 69,000 fans, Crosby took a hit from Washington Capitals center David Steckel. It happened near center ice, in the neutral zone, at a moment when neither player was involved in the play. Steckel's shoulder caught Crosby's jaw as the two crossed paths. It was not a dramatic collision. There was no malice in it, no obvious intent to injure. Steckel was a journeyman forward, a bottom six player whose name would be forgotten entirely were it not for this single, accidental moment of contact. Crosby stayed in the game. He finished the Winter Classic. He played the next game too. 4 days later, on January 10, 2011, during a game against the Tampa Bay Lightning, Crosby took another hit. This one came from Tampa Bay defenseman Victor Hedman, a legal body check that drove Crosby into the boards along the end wall. Crosby went down. He left the game. He did not return that night, and he would not return for a very, very long time. The diagnosis was a concussion, a traumatic brain injury caused by the rapid acceleration and deceleration of the brain inside the skull. In a sport defined by speed and physical contact, concussions were an occupational hazard as old as the game itself. For decades, players had simply played through them, dismissing the symptoms as getting your bell rung, shaking off the headaches and the dizziness and returning to the ice, because that was what tough hockey players did. The culture of the sport demanded it. The expectation was that you absorbed the hit, you wiped the blood off your face, and you went back out for the next shift. Concussions were not taken seriously because the consequences of taking them seriously were too frightening to contemplate. But Crosby's concussion was different. The symptoms did not subside after a few days of rest. They did not fade after a few weeks. The headaches persisted, sharp and relentless, the kind of pain that makes concentration impossible and sleep elusive. He experienced sensitivity to light so severe that he had to sit in darkened rooms for hours at a time. He had difficulty focusing, difficulty reading, difficulty watching television. He experienced neck pain that radiated into his shoulders and down his spine. He was 23 years old, in what should have been the absolute peak of his athletic prime, and he was sitting in the dark, alone, unable to do the one thing that had defined his entire existence. Crosby missed the final 41 games of the 2010 to 2011 season. He missed the playoffs. He missed the summer training that professional athletes use to maintain and improve their conditioning. When the 2011 to 2012 season began in October, he was still not cleared to play. The concussion symptoms had not fully resolved. The medical team overseeing his recovery could not provide a definitive timeline for his return, because concussion science in 2011 was still an evolving field, full of uncertainty and unanswered questions. There were no guaranteed timelines, no clear protocols that could assure a player or his family that full recovery was certain. In late November of 2011, nearly 11 months after the initial injury, Crosby was cleared to return. He played 8 games over a span of 2.5 weeks. He scored 2 goals and added 4 assists. He looked like himself. The relief was palpable, not just in Pittsburgh, but across the league. And then the symptoms came back. The headaches returned. The sensitivity to light returned. The fog descended again. Crosby was shut down for the second time, and this time the fear was even greater, because recurrent concussion symptoms carried darker implications. Some players who suffered multiple concussions never recovered fully. Some retired prematurely. Some experienced cognitive difficulties that lasted for years, for decades, for the rest of their lives. In total, Crosby missed roughly 100 games over the span of nearly a year and a half. He missed significant portions of 2 seasons. He missed the 2012 Winter Classic. He missed the All-Star Game. He missed the opportunity to represent Canada at the 2012 World Championship. He missed the daily rhythms of professional hockey that had structured his life since he was 18. And in their absence, he was forced to confront questions that no amount of talent could answer. Would he play again? Would he be the same player if he did? Would the headaches ever fully stop? Was the career he had built, the career that began in a basement in Cole Harbour and had taken him to the summit of the sport, already over at 24? He has spoken about this period with a candour that is unusual for someone so private. He described the fear, the uncertainty, the isolation of recovering from an invisible injury in a sport that valorizes visible toughness. He described the frustration of watching his teammates play without him, of sitting in the press box in street clothes while the game continued without him on the ice below. He described the moments of despair when the symptoms seemed permanent, when the idea of life without hockey, a life he had never imagined and was not prepared for, seemed like the only possible future. When Crosby finally returned to full-time action in the 2012 to 2013 season, a season shortened to 48 games by yet another labor dispute between the owners and the players, he played with an urgency that suggested a man who understood that nothing was guaranteed. He appeared in 36 games. He scored 15 goals and added 41 assists for 56 points. He won the scoring title for the second time in his career. He was named the Hart Trophy winner as the league's most valuable player for the second time. He was, by any statistical measure, the best player in hockey, and he had done it after losing a year and a half to an injury that many believed would end his career, or at the very least, permanently diminish his abilities. The numbers are striking, almost impossibly so, when you consider the full scope of what Crosby accomplished, despite the injuries that marred his career. Over 20 NHL seasons, he played in approximately 1,200 regular season games, fewer than many of his contemporaries due to the time missed. Yet he scored more than 590 goals and accumulated more than 1,050 assists for more than 1,640 career points. His career points per game average hovered around 1.36, a figure that placed him among the 5 or 6 most productive players in the entire history of the sport, alongside Gretzky, Lemieux, Mike Bossy, and a small handful of others. He achieved this despite missing the equivalent of roughly 3 full seasons to concussions, a broken jaw, a wrist injury, and the various other ailments that accumulate over 2 decades of professional hockey. The second defining moment of Crosby's career was the back-to-back Stanley Cup championships of 2016 and 2017. The Penguins had not won a championship since 2009, a span of 7 years that included first-round playoff exits, coaching changes, roster turnover, and the gradual realization that windows of opportunity in professional sports do not stay open forever. The salary cap ensured that the Penguins could not simply buy the best players available. Draft picks did not always develop as hoped. Key players were lost to free agency or traded to manage the cap. The championship core of 2009 aged and diminished. In December of 2015, with the Penguins struggling under head coach Mike Johnston, general manager Jim Rutherford made the decision to fire Johnston and replace him with Mike Sullivan, a former NHL forward who had been coaching the Penguins American Hockey League affiliate in Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, Pennsylvania. Sullivan was not a celebrity hire. He was not a big name. He was a hockey lifer who believed in speed, aggression, and accountability, and he implemented those principles immediately upon taking over in Pittsburgh. The transformation was swift and dramatic. Under Sullivan, the Penguins went from a team that was below the playoff line to a team that was playing the fastest, most exciting hockey in the league. Sullivan gave expanded roles to young players like Jake Guentzel, a quiet winger from Minnesota who would become one of Crosby's most effective linmates. He trusted Brian Rust and Connor Sheary, players who had spent time in the minor leagues and were not considered stars, but who played Sullivan's system with intelligence and energy. He managed the goaltending situation between Matt Murray, a 21-year-old who had barely played in the NHL, and Marc-Andre Fleury, the longtime starter who had been the backbone of the franchise for over a decade. And he unleashed Crosby, removing the tactical constraints that had been placed on him and allowing him to play with the freedom and creativity that had made him great. The Penguins entered the 2016 playoffs as the second seed in the Eastern Conference. In the first round, they defeated the New York Rangers in 5 games. In the second round, they eliminated the Washington Capitals in 6 games, beating Ovechkin's team once again in the postseason and reinforcing the narrative, fair or not, that Crosby elevated his game in the playoffs, while Ovechkin could not get his team past Pittsburgh. In the Eastern Conference Final, the Penguins faced the Tampa Bay Lightning, a talented team led by Steven Stamkos and Nikita Kucherov. The series went 7 games, pushing Pittsburgh to its limit before the Penguins prevailed. And in the Stanley Cup final, they met the San Jose Sharks. The Sharks were making their first appearance in the Cup final in franchise history. They were a proud organization with a roster of accomplished veterans, players who had been waiting years for this opportunity. Joe Thornton, the bearded centre from London, Ontario, who had won the Hart Trophy in 2006, but had never reached the final. Patrick Marleau, the quiet, durable winger who had spent nearly 2 decades in San Jose. Brent Burns, the wild-haired defenseman, whose offensive skills made him one of the most dynamic blueliners in the game. Joe Pavelski, the undersized centre from Wisconsin, whose intelligence and toughness had made him a team captain. They had earned their place in the final. They deserved to be there, but the Penguins were better. Pittsburgh won the series in 6 games, clinching the Stanley Cup on June 12, 2016, on home ice at what was then known as Consol Energy Center. Sidney Crosby was awarded the Conn Smythe Trophy as the most valuable player of the playoffs. He had scored 6 goals and added 13 assists for 19 points in 24 playoff games, leading the tournament in scoring. He was 28 years old, and he had won his second Stanley Cup, 7 years after his first. The celebration was joyous but measured, the celebration of a man who understood the value of what he held because he knew how close he had come to never holding it again. But Crosby and the Penguins were not finished. Following the season 2016 to 2017, they became the first team in the salary cap era to win back-to-back Stanley Cups, and the first team in the entire league to achieve the feat since the Detroit Red Wings had done it in 1997 and 1998. The difficulty of repeating as champions in the modern NHL cannot be overstated. The salary cap ensures financial parity. The draft rewards losing teams with higher picks. Free agency allows players to leave for more money or better opportunities. The physical and mental toll of a long playoff run makes it harder to sustain excellence into the following season. Everything about the structure of the modern league is designed to prevent dynasties, to ensure that no team can dominate for an extended period. The Penguins defied all of it. In the 2017 playoffs, Pittsburgh defeated the Columbus Blue Jackets in 5 games, the Washington Capitals in 7 games, the Ottawa Senators in 7 games in a series that was decided by a double overtime goal in the deciding game, and the Nashville Predators in 6 games in the Stanley Cup final. Crosby was once again awarded the Conn Smythe Trophy, making him the first player since Mario Lemieux, his mentor and the man in whose house he had once lived, to win the playoff MVP award in consecutive years. He was also only the 3rd player in history to win 3 or more Conn Smythe trophies, joining Patrick Roy and Lemieux himself. He had now won 3 Stanley Cups. His name would appear on the trophy 3 times. He had cemented his place, not merely among the great players of his era, but among the greatest champions the sport had ever seen. In the annals of the Stanley Cup, in the long silver history of that battered, beautiful trophy, the name Sidney Crosby would occupy a place of permanent honour. The fourth defining chapter of his career unfolded on the international stage, and specifically on a single afternoon in February of 2010. The Winter Olympics were being held in Vancouver, British Columbia, and the men's ice hockey tournament was the centrepiece of the Canadian experience. The roster assembled by Hockey Canada for that tournament was one of the most talented collections of hockey players ever gathered on a single team. Crosby was there, along with Jarome Iginla, Joe Thornton, Ryan Getzlaf, Jonathan Hughes, Patrice Bergeron, Duncan Keith, Shea Weber, Drew Doughty, Scott Niedermayer, Chris Pronger, Roberto Luongo, and Martin Brodeur. The expectation placed on this team by the Canadian public was absolute. Gold was not hoped for, it was demanded. The tournament proceeded through its preliminary rounds and knockout stage until, on February 28, 2010, Canada and the United States met in the gold medal game at Canada Hockey Place in Vancouver. The atmosphere was extraordinary, the kind of collective anticipation that only the Olympics can produce. 20 million Canadians were watching on television, a number that represented roughly 60% of the entire country's population. The game was tight, intense, and beautifully played by both sides. Canada led 2-1 entering the final minutes of the third period, and then, with 24.4 seconds remaining on the clock, American forward Zach Parise scored to tie the game. The arena went silent. The country held its breath. Overtime. At 7 minutes and 40 seconds of the overtime period, Sidney Crosby received a pass from Jarome Iginla along the left half wall in the American zone. He moved toward the net, the puck on his stick, the weight of a nation on his back, and he shot. The puck went between the legs of American goaltender Ryan Miller and into the net. Goal. Canada wins. Gold medal. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Canada had experienced in a generation. The streets of Vancouver erupted. Downtown intersections became impromptu parties. Strangers embraced. Car horns filled the air in cities from St. John's to Victoria. The goal became known simply as the Golden Goal, and it entered the permanent mythology of Canadian culture, a moment that transcended hockey and became a shared national memory. And the man who scored it, the man who delivered a country's dream with a single shot, was the kid from Cole Harbour. The fifth chapter of Crosby's career involved the long, fascinating, and ultimately respectful rivalry with Alexander Ovechkin. From the moment they entered the league, the two were presented as opposites by the media and by the NHL's marketing department. Crosby was the cerebral, responsible, two-way centre from Canada, the captain who did everything right, who checked every box, who was almost painfully perfect. Ovechkin was the explosive, risk-taking, pure goal-scoring winger from Russia, the showman who celebrated with an abandon that thrilled some observers and irritated others, who played with a freedom and a joy that made him one of the most entertaining athletes in any sport. Crosby was Pittsburgh, Ovechkin was Washington. Crosby was quiet, Ovechkin was loud. The contrast was irresistible. They met in the playoffs repeatedly, most memorably in the second round of the 2009 postseason, when Crosby's Penguins defeated Ovechkin's Capitals in a 7-game series that featured some of the most exciting hockey of the era. Game 2 of that series, won by Pittsburgh 8-4, featured a combined 12 goals and a performance from both stars that felt like a heavyweight championship bout. They met again in the playoffs in 2016 and 2017, with the Penguins winning both series on their way to Stanley Cup championships. The narrative that developed around these encounters, the narrative that Crosby was a winner while Ovechkin was not, that Crosby rose to the occasion while Ovechkin fell short, was simplistic and somewhat unfair, but it was persistent and it was powerful. That narrative finally shifted in 2018, when Ovechkin led the Capitals to the Stanley Cup championship, defeating the Vegas Golden Knights in the final. Ovechkin was awarded the Conn Smythe Trophy. He celebrated with a joy and abandon that was pure, unfiltered, magnificently Ovechkin, carrying the cup through the streets of Washington, swimming in a public fountain with it, drinking from it at every opportunity. Crosby offered his congratulations with genuine grace. The rivalry, which had been framed as a competition between two men, revealed itself to be something deeper. A partnership of sorts, a dynamic in which two extraordinary players had pushed each other to heights that neither might have reached alone. The game of hockey was immeasurably richer for having both of them. There is another dimension of Crosby's career that deserves examination, and that is his evolution as a leader. When he was named captain of the Pittsburgh Penguins before the 2007 to 2008 season, he was just 20 years old. He was the youngest captain in the franchise's history, and one of the youngest in the history of the league. The captaincy in hockey carries a significance that goes beyond the ceremonial. The captain wears the letter C on his sweater, a symbol that is visible to every teammate, every opponent, and every fan in the arena. He is the team's representative to the officials, the only player allowed to discuss calls and penalties with the referees during the game. He is expected to lead by example, to set the standard for effort and preparation, to be the voice in the locker room during the quiet moments between periods when the game hangs in the balance. Crosby was not a natural communicator in the traditional sense. He was not the type of captain who delivered fiery speeches before big games, who pounded tables and raised his voice and demanded effort through sheer force of personality. His leadership style was quieter, more consistent, more rooted in action than in words. He led by arriving first and leaving last. He led by playing the hardest shift of every game. He led by the example of his preparation, by the seriousness with which he approached every practice, every video session, every pre-game warm-up. His teammates followed not because he told them to, but because they saw what he did and recognized that anything less than their own best effort would be insufficient in the face of his. Former teammates have described the experience of playing with Crosby in revealing terms. They speak of a standard that was established not through demands, but through demonstration. If Crosby practiced with full intensity, you could not practice at half speed. If Crosby watched film for 2 hours after a loss, you could not leave the building without feeling that you had not done enough. If Crosby played through pain that would have kept other players in the training room, you could not sit out with a bruise or a sore muscle without questioning your own commitment. This is the essence of leadership by example, and it is the most demanding form of leadership because it requires the leader to be the best version of himself every single day, without exception, without reprieve, without the luxury of a bad day. The captaincy also brought with it a public responsibility that Crosby fulfilled with characteristic discipline. He represented the Penguins at charity events and community functions. He visited hospitals and schools. He participated in the league's promotional activities. He did all of this without complaint and without seeking credit, understanding that the captain's role extended beyond the rink and into the community that supported the team. Pittsburgh embraced him as one of its own, and he embraced Pittsburgh in return, purchasing a home in the area and establishing roots in a city that was far from the Nova Scotia of his childhood, but that had become, in every meaningful sense, his home. The 2014 season brought another injury challenge when Crosby was struck in the mouth by a puck during a game against the New York Rangers. The puck hit him flush in the face, knocking out a tooth and causing damage that required dental surgery. It was the kind of injury that happens regularly in hockey, a sport played with a frozen rubber disc, traveling at speeds that can exceed 100 miles per hour, but it was a reminder of the physical vulnerability that exists beneath the armor of pads and helmets. He returned from that injury and continued to produce at an elite level. In the 2013 to 2014 season, he scored 36 goals and added 68 assists for 104 points in 80 games, winning another Art Ross Trophy as the league's leading scorer. He represented Canada at the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi, Russia, where the Canadian team won the gold medal once again, this time without allowing a single goal against in the entire elimination round. The defensive performance was extraordinary, and Crosby's contribution, while not reflected prominently in the scoring statistics, was recognised by the tournament organisers, who named him the tournament's most valuable player. The period between Crosby's first Stanley Cup in 2009 and his second in 2016 was a complex chapter in his career. There were first-round playoff exits. There were coaching changes, with Dan Bilsma replacing Michel Terrier in 2009, winning the Cup that spring, and then being replaced himself by Johnston in 2014 after a series of disappointing postseason performances. There were roster changes as the salary cap forced the Penguins to make difficult decisions about which players to keep and which to let go. Jordan Staal was traded. James Neal was traded. Chris Letang battled injuries. The core aged. The window appeared to be closing. It was in this context that the hiring of Mike Sullivan became so transformative. Sullivan did not merely change the Penguins' tactical approach. He changed the culture. He demanded accountability from every player, regardless of status or salary. He rewarded effort and punished complacency. He trusted young players with significant responsibilities and challenged veterans to keep pace with a faster, more demanding system. And he built a relationship with Crosby that brought out the best in both men. Sullivan gave Crosby the tactical freedom to play his game. Crosby gave Sullivan the on-ice performance that validated his coaching philosophy. It was a partnership that produced 2 Stanley Cups in 2 years and restored the Penguins to the summit of the sport. The experience of winning back-to-back championships was different for Crosby than winning his first cup had been. The first cup in 2009 was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream, the validation of every sacrifice, every early morning, every dented dryer. The second and third cups in 2016 and 2017 was something else. They were the assertion of mastery. They were the statement of a player and a team that had not merely reached the top, but had learned how to stay there, how to sustain excellence in a league designed to prevent exactly that. They were, in their way, more impressive than the first, because they were achieved against greater odds and with a deeper understanding of what was required. The 2017 Stanley Cup Final against the Nashville Predators presented a unique challenge for Crosby and the Penguins. Nashville was a team built on defensive structure and goaltending, anchored by Pekka Rinne, one of the premier goaltenders in the league, and a blue line core that featured PK Subban, Roman Josi, Ryan Ellis, and Matthias Ekhl. The Predators had stormed through the Western Conference playoffs, sweeping the Chicago Blackhawks in the first round in a stunning upset, then dispatching the St. Louis Blues and the Anaheim Ducks. They arrived at the final with momentum and confidence, and a home crowd in Nashville that had become one of the loudest and most passionate in all of professional sports. The series began in Pittsburgh, where the Penguins won the first 2 games on home ice, establishing an early advantage that would prove decisive. But the Predators fought back when the series shifted to Nashville, winning games 3 and 4 at Bridgestone Arena in front of crowds that transformed the streets of Lower Broadway into an open-air hockey festival. Country music artists performed. Fans gathered by the thousands to watch the games on outdoor screens. The atmosphere was electric, a celebration of a city that had fallen in love with hockey in a way that no one had predicted when the franchise was established in 1998. The Penguins regrouped and won Game 5 in Pittsburgh, then travelled to Nashville for Game 6 with a chance to close out the series and become back-to-back champions. The game was played on June 11, 2017, and the Penguins won it 2-0, with Patrick Hornquist scoring the cup-clinching goal into an empty net in the final seconds. It was an anticlimactic finish to an extraordinary run, but the result was all that mattered. The Pittsburgh Penguins had won the Stanley Cup for the 3rd time in Crosby's career, the 5th time in franchise history, and they had done it in consecutive years, an achievement that many had believed impossible under the salary cap structure. Crosby's performance in that 2017 postseason was a masterwork of leadership and skill. He finished with 8 goals and 19 assists for 27 points in 25 playoff games, leading all scorers in the tournament for the 2nd consecutive year. His ability to produce points consistently over the course of a 2-month playoff run, game after game, series after series, against increasingly desperate and talented opposition was the clearest evidence of what separated him from his peers. Other players had more spectacular individual moments. Other players could take over a single game with a dazzling display of skill. But no one in the modern game could sustain excellence over an entire playoff run the way Crosby could. The aftermath of the back-to-back championships brought a new set of questions. Could the Penguins win a third consecutive cup? Could they become only the second team in the modern era after the New York Islanders dynasty of the early 1980s to win 3 or more in a row? The answer came quickly and definitively. In the 2018 playoffs, the Penguins were eliminated in the second round by the Washington Capitals, who went on to win their first Stanley Cup in franchise history. It was Ovechkin's moment, and Crosby, ever the sportsman, watched from the sideline as his rival finally achieved what had eluded him for so long. The years that followed the back-to-back championships brought a gradual evolution in Crosby's game and in the team around him. The Penguins remained competitive, qualifying for the playoffs in most seasons, but they were no longer the dominant force they had been in 2016 and 2017. The roster aged, key players departed, injuries accumulated, and Crosby himself, while still performing at an elite level, began to show the first subtle signs of the physical decline that comes to every athlete, no matter how gifted, no matter how devoted to training and preparation. His goal-scoring pace slowed slightly, from the mid-30s to the high 20s per season. His assist totals remained strong, reflecting his continued brilliance as a playmaker. But the explosive speed that had once allowed him to blow past defensemen became a half step slower, then a full step, then something that had to be compensated for, with positioning and anticipation. He adapted, as he had always adapted, finding new ways to be effective, new angles from which to create offense, new methods of using his body and his intelligence to offset the erosion of his physical tools. It was a masterclass in professional longevity, a demonstration of how a truly great player can extend his relevance long past the point when a merely good player would have faded into irrelevance. Crosby's consistency in individual award races throughout the 2010s was a testament to his sustained excellence. Even in seasons when the Penguins struggled as a team, even in years when injuries limited his games played, he remained among the league's top scorers and among the leading candidates for the Hart Trophy. In the 2013 to 2014 season, he posted 104 points in 80 games. In the 2014 to 2015 season, he had 84 points in 77 games. Lower by his standards, but still among the best in the league. And these totals were achieved not through inflated power play statistics or empty calorie points against weak competition, but through genuine, grinding, shift-by-shift dominance against the best players and best defensive systems in the world. His face-off ability was among the most underrated aspects of his game. Throughout his career, he consistently won more than 50% of his draws, a figure that placed him among the best face-off centers in the league. Winning face-offs is one of the least glamorous but most important skills in hockey. It determines possession, and possession determines offensive opportunity. A center who wins face-offs gives his team extra seconds with the puck, extra chances to set up in the offensive zone, extra moments of controlled play in a sport where control is always contested. Crosby approached face-offs with the same obsessive attention to detail that he brought to every other aspect of the game. He studied opposing centers' tendencies. He practiced his grip and his timing. He treated every draw as a miniature competition within the larger competition of the game, and he won more of them than he lost. His defensive game evolved significantly over the course of his career. In his early years, he was primarily an offensive force, a player whose value was measured in goals and assists and highlight reel plays. As he matured, he became increasingly conscious of his responsibilities in his own zone, of the importance of back-checking and positioning and supporting his defensemen. By the time he reached his late 20s and early 30s, he had become one of the most complete two-way centers in the league, a player who could be trusted in every situation, on the power play and the penalty kill, in the offensive zone and the defensive zone, in the first minute of the game and the last. This evolution was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate effort, of hours spent studying defensive systems, of conversations with coaches and experienced teammates about positioning and reads, and the subtle art of disrupting an opponent's attack without the puck. It was the product of a competitive drive that could not accept being anything less than complete, that saw any weakness in his game as a challenge to be overcome rather than a limitation to be accepted. The result was a player who, at his peak, had no discernible weakness, a centre who could hurt you in every area of the ice and in every phase of the game. The rivalry between Crosby and Ovechkin became the defining competitive narrative of their era. They met in the playoffs repeatedly, most memorably in the second round of the 2009 playoffs, a series that many consider the greatest playoff matchup of the 21st century. Crosby's Penguins prevailed in 7 games, and the series showcased two fundamentally different approaches to the game operating at the highest possible level. Crosby's precision against Ovechkin's power, Crosby's team-first mentality against Ovechkin's individual brilliance. It was a rivalry that transcended personal animosity and became something richer, a philosophical debate about what hockey excellence looked like. That narrative finally shifted in 2018 when Ovechkin led the Washington Capitals to their first Stanley Cup championship. The image of Ovechkin lifting the cup, tears streaming down his face, was one of the most emotional moments in recent hockey history, and Crosby, characteristically, handled it with grace. He understood what the moment meant. He understood what Ovechkin had endured to reach it. The rivalry, which had been defined by competition, evolved into something closer to mutual recognition. Two warriors who had tested each other for more than a decade, acknowledging the depth of their shared commitment to the game. Crosby's consistency in individual award races throughout the 2010s was remarkable in its own right, even as his body accumulated the damage of more than 1,000 professional games. Even as younger players entered the league with fresh legs and evolving skill sets, he remained among the most productive and respected players in the sport. He won the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP 3 times, more than any other player in the modern era. He won the Ted Lindsay Award 3 times. He was named to the All-Star team repeatedly. The consistency was almost monotonous. The way excellence becomes monotonous when it is sustained long enough to become expected. But beneath that consistency was an enormous amount of work, invisible to the casual observer, that made it possible. There is another dimension of Crosby's career that deserves examination, and that is his evolution as a leader. When he was named captain of the Penguins at 20 years old, many questioned whether someone so young could command the respect of a professional locker room. The question was reasonable, but ultimately misguided. Crosby's authority did not come from his title, it came from his conduct. He was the first player on the ice and the last one off. He watched more film than anyone. He held himself to a standard that was, by all accounts, almost impossibly high, and he expected the same from everyone around him, not through speeches or confrontation, but through the relentless daily example of what full commitment looked like. The captaincy also brought with it a public responsibility that Crosby fulfilled with a seriousness that sometimes bordered on rigidity. He understood that his words carried weight, that a single careless comment could become a headline, a distraction, a fracture in the careful facade that professional sports teams must maintain. And so he chose his words with the same precision that he chose his passes, saying enough to satisfy the obligation without ever saying too much. Critics called him boring. Teammates called him reliable. The distinction between those two assessments reveals more about the observers than about the man being observed. The 2017 Stanley Cup final against the Nashville Predators was a different kind of challenge. Nashville, making their first appearance in the Cup final, brought an atmosphere that was unlike anything the league had seen. The Bridgestone Arena was deafening, the crowd's energy a weapon in itself. The Predators were physical, fast, and deeply motivated, playing with the desperation of a team that knew this opportunity might not come again. The series began in Pittsburgh, where the Penguins won the first 2 games and established control of the series. But Nashville fought back, winning Game 3 on home ice, in a performance that suggested the series was far from over. Game 4 was a turning point. The Predators won again, tying the series at 2 games apiece, and generating genuine doubt about whether Pittsburgh could close out a team playing with such intensity and belief. The Penguins regrouped and won Game 5 in Pittsburgh, then travelled to Nashville for Game 6, needing one more victory to complete the repeat. The atmosphere in Nashville was electric, the crowd willing their team forward with a passion that transcended ordinary fandom. But Crosby and the Penguins were too experienced, too composed, too deeply committed to be denied. They won Game 6 and with it, their second consecutive Stanley Cup. Crosby's performance in that 2017 postseason was a masterwork of sustained excellence under pressure. He finished with 8 goals and 21 assists for 29 points in 25 games, earning his second consecutive Conn Smythe Trophy. No player had won back-to-back Conn Smythe Awards since the trophy was established in 1965. The achievement was historic by any measure, a testament to sustained excellence under the most intense and unforgiving pressure the sport can possibly offer. The achievement placed Crosby in a category of playoff performance that existed, for all practical purposes, alone. The aftermath of the back-to-back championships brought a new set of questions and challenges. Having achieved something extraordinary, something that no team in the National Hockey League had accomplished in nearly 2 decades, the Penguins faced the inevitable question of what comes next. Dynasties in the salary cap era are fragile constructions, assembled through equal parts talent, luck, and careful management. Players depart through free agency, age claims the legs that once carried teams to glory, and the hunger that fueled championship runs becomes harder to maintain once the ultimate goal has been achieved. There is a version of Sidney Crosby that exists in the public imagination, a version that has been polished and maintained and carefully presented over the course of 2 decades of professional athletics. This version appears on television broadcasts, in highlight packages, in the carefully scripted interviews that precede and follow every important game. This version is professional in the extreme, measured in his words, controlled in his emotions, unfailingly gracious in victory and composed in defeat. This version says the right things at the right times. He thanks his teammates, he credits the opposition, he deflects praise with the efficiency of a veteran diplomat. This version of Sidney Crosby is real. It is not an act, but it is not the entire picture. The private Crosby, the one who exists behind the wall of public composure, is a man of extraordinary, almost clinical obsessiveness. Former teammates and coaches have described his preparation regimen in terms that range from admiring to awestruck to mildly exhausted. He studies video of opposing teams for hours, not as a cursory review but as a detailed forensic analysis. He watches the same sequences over and over, looking for patterns that other players would never notice. A goaltender's slight forward lean on his glove side, a defenseman's tendency to angle his body a few degrees to the right in one-on-one situations, a center's habit of looking at the clock during the final seconds of a penalty kill. He files these observations away in a mental database that he accesses during games, with an instinct that appears effortless, but is, in fact, the product of hundreds of hours of invisible labor. He practices his shot after every practice, staying on the ice long after the coaching staff has blown the final whistle. He takes pucks to the same corner, the same slot, the same position at the top of the crease, and he fires them with a repetitive precision that would bore most players to distraction. He requests specific types of stick tape, particular brands of composite sticks, exact lacing patterns on his skates. He is particular about the curvature of his blade, the lie of his stick, the tension of his laces. These are not eccentricities. They are the habits of a man who has spent his entire life eliminating variables, reducing the gap between preparation and execution to as close to zero as humanly possible. Let that sink in. The player who appears to glide through games with natural ease, whose creativity on the ice seems spontaneous and instinctive, is in fact the product of a preparation regimen so demanding that it would exhaust most professional athletes. The gap between how easy Crosby makes hockey look and how hard he works to make it look that way is the defining characteristic of his genius. It is the gap that separates great players from generational ones. Talent gets you to the NHL, work ethic keeps you there. But the combination of transcendent talent and obsessive work ethic, that is what creates a legacy. He is also, by every available account, a deeply private individual, perhaps the most private superstar in the history of major North American professional sports. In an era when athletes build personal brands through social media platforms, when every workout is filmed and posted, every meal photographed and shared, every opinion broadcast to millions of followers, Crosby maintains a level of personal privacy that feels almost anachronistic, as if he belongs to a different century. He does not maintain a significant presence on social media platforms. He does not court celebrity attention. He does not appear at parties or premieres or nightclubs. He does not date publicly. He does not comment on controversies that do not directly involve him. He lives quietly, trains with a monastic discipline, and lets his play speak for him with a consistency that borders on stubbornness. This is not a marketing strategy or a carefully constructed image. It is, by all indications, simply who Sidney Crosby is. But the privacy comes at a cost that is not always visible, because when you build a wall around yourself, even for the most understandable of reasons, you become unknowable to the millions of people who watch you play. And when you are unknowable, you become a canvas onto which others project their own assumptions, their own narratives, their own desires. For some fans and observers, Crosby's reserve made him boring, a corporate automaton programmed to score goals and give bland interviews. For others, it made him suspicious, as if the composure were concealing something darker or stranger beneath the surface. And for still others, it made him admirable, a throwback to an earlier era of professional sports when athletes were judged solely by their performance and not by their social media engagement. The truth, as always, lives somewhere between these projections. Crosby's privacy was not born of arrogance or emotional detachment. It was born of survival. He had been famous since he was 14 years old. He had been scrutinized, analyzed, praised, and criticized by media professionals and amateur commentators alike for more than half his life. Every friendship he formed was potentially public. Every romantic relationship was potentially tabloid fodder. Every mistake he made, however minor, was potentially a headline. The wall he built around his personal life was a defense mechanism, a way to preserve some small corner of his existence that belonged only to him, that could not be consumed by the public's insatiable appetite for the lives of famous people. Let that sink in. The kid from Cole Harbour, the boy who just wanted to play hockey in his father's basement, spent his entire adult life protecting himself from the consequences of being extraordinary. The gift that had opened every door in the world of hockey had also constructed a cage of fame and expectation that followed him everywhere. And the cage, comfortable and gilded as it was, lined with championship rings and MVP trophies and the adulation of millions, was still, at its core, a cage. The concussions added a dimension to Crosby's story that goes beyond sports. Head injuries are not like broken bones or torn ligaments. They do not heal on a predictable timeline. They do not respond to surgery or physical therapy in ways that doctors can reliably predict. They do not leave visible scars that can be shown to skeptics as proof of suffering. They live inside the skull, invisible and insidious, raising questions that may not have answers for years or decades. Crosby has been measured in his public statements about the long-term effects of his head injuries. He has acknowledged the fear that accompanied his recovery period. He has spoken about the difficulty of watching games from the press box while wearing street clothes, unable to help his teammates, unable to participate in the only activity that had ever given his life structure and meaning. The broader conversation about concussions in hockey and in all contact sports shifted dramatically during Crosby's career. When he entered the NHL in 2005, concussions were still widely dismissed as a minor inconvenience, a temporary disruption that tough players shook off and played through. By the time he suffered his own concussions in 2011, the medical community and the public were beginning to understand the true severity of the problem. Research into chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the degenerative brain condition linked to repeated head trauma, was being published with increasing frequency and with findings that were impossible to ignore. Former players in hockey, football, and other contact sports were being diagnosed with the condition posthumously, and the symptoms they had exhibited in life, memory loss, depression, aggression, cognitive decline, told a story of suffering that the sports world had been complicit in ignoring. Crosby's concussions became a focal point of this evolving conversation, not because he sought the role of advocate, but because his stature in the game made his situation impossible to dismiss. When the best player in the world is sitting out for more than a year with a brain injury, when the face of the league is unable to play because of a condition that the league's own culture had historically minimized, the cognitive dissonance becomes untenable. Crosby's absence highlighted the inadequacy of the NHL's concussion protocols, the culture of toughness that discouraged players from reporting symptoms for fear of being perceived as weak, and the long-term risks that every player in the league accepted, explicitly or implicitly, every time he stepped onto the ice. The deeper truth of Sidney Crosby's career is that it was built on a foundation of sacrifice that most fans never saw and most commentators never discussed. Not the dramatic, public kind of sacrifice that generates headlines and documentaries, but the quiet, daily, cumulative kind. The sacrifice of a normal adolescence, given over to hockey at an age when most children are still discovering who they are. The sacrifice of anonymity, traded for a fame that followed him into grocery stores and restaurants and airports for the rest of his life. The sacrifice of a body given over to a sport that took from it relentlessly, demanding speed and strength and endurance and absorbing in return the accumulated damage of thousands of collisions, thousands of falls, thousands of shots blocked and hits delivered and punishments absorbed. He gave everything he had to hockey, and hockey gave him everything in return. Everything, that is, except the ability to walk away from it without scars, without questions, without wondering what the price of all that glory might eventually be. There is also the question of what Crosby's career means in the context of the broader evolution of hockey as a sport. When he entered the league, the NHL was still a predominantly North American enterprise, with a significant but secondary presence in Europe. By the time his career reached its later stages, the game had become truly global, with players from more than 20 countries competing in the NHL and the league exploring expansion into new markets and new continents. Crosby's career spanned this transformation, and his performance on the international stage, in the Olympics and the World Championships and the World Cup of Hockey, helped to legitimize the NHL's claim to being a global sport played at the highest level. His playing style, too, influenced the direction of the game. Before Crosby, the conventional wisdom held that the most valuable player on a hockey team was either the goal-scoring forward or the shutdown defenseman. Crosby demonstrated that the most valuable player was the one who could do everything, a center who could score and create and defend and win face-offs and kill penalties and play on the power play and lead the locker room. He was the prototype for the modern complete center and the players who followed in his wake. From Jonathan Toews to Patrice Bergeron to Anze Kopitar to Connor McDavid, all bore the imprint of his influence, whether they acknowledged it directly or not. The relationship between Crosby and the city of Pittsburgh deserves its own extended examination. He arrived as a teenager in a city that was still mourning the decline of its steel industry, still adjusting to a new economic reality, still searching for the sources of pride and identity that could replace the mills and factories that had once defined it. The Steelers provided one such source. The Penguins, thanks largely to Crosby, provided another. His presence helped to revitalize interest in the franchise, contributing to the construction of a new arena, the PPG Paints Arena, which opened in 2010 and replaced the aging Mellon Arena, a facility that had served the team since 1961. His championships brought joy to a city that knew hardship, and his quiet determination reflected the values that Pittsburgh held dear, the belief that hard work and perseverance matter more than flash and self-promotion. There were moments when the relationship was tested. The labor disputes, the lockout-shortened seasons, the frustrating playoff exits all created friction between the fans and the franchise. But Crosby himself was largely exempt from the criticism. He was the constant, the one element of the Penguins' identity that remained stable and dependable through every change of coach, every roster turnover, every off-season of uncertainty. He was the face on the jersey, the name on the marquee, the reason that the arena was full on Tuesday nights in January when the snow was falling and the temperature was in the single digits, and there were 100 easier things to do than drive downtown and watch a hockey game. The matter of what comes after hockey is one that Crosby has addressed only obliquely in public. He has not spoken in detail about his plans for retirement, has not indicated whether he intends to pursue coaching or management or broadcasting or some entirely different career. His privacy on this subject is consistent with his privacy on every other subject, but it also reflects a deeper truth about the relationship between a professional athlete and his sport. For a man who has played hockey since he was old enough to walk, who has defined himself through the game for more than 3 decades, the question of what comes next is not merely a logistical challenge, it is an existential one. The transition from active player to retired athlete is one of the most difficult passages in professional sports, and it is especially difficult for players who have been at the absolute summit of their profession. The structure that the sport provides, the daily routine of practice and games and travel, the camaraderie of the locker room, the clarity of purpose that comes from competing at the highest level, all of this disappears overnight when a career ends. In its place comes an openness, a freedom that can feel more like emptiness than liberation. Former players have described the experience in terms that range from disorienting to devastating. The adjustment is particularly acute for players who, like Crosby, have never known any other life. The question of Crosby's long-term health adds another layer of complexity to this transition. The concussions he suffered, the accumulated damage from 20 years of professional hockey, the wear on his joints and his spine and his muscles, these are not concerns that disappear when the last game is played. They are concerns that may intensify in retirement, as the body, no longer supported by the training regimen and the medical care of a professional sports franchise, begins to feel the full weight of everything it has absorbed. Crosby has been careful not to speculate publicly about his long-term health, but the awareness that hangs over every retired hockey player of his generation, the awareness that the price of the game may not be fully known for years or decades, is a reality that shapes the way his career is understood and the way his legacy will eventually be assessed. His playing style, too, influenced the direction of the game in ways that extended far beyond his own statistics. Before Crosby, the prevailing model of a franchise center was either the flashy playmaker or the dominant physical force. Crosby blended those archetypes into something new, a 200-foot player who could dominate in every zone, on every shift, in every situation. He was as dangerous on the penalty kill as on the power play. He was as effective in the defensive zone as in the offensive zone. He played a brand of hockey that was simultaneously beautiful and functional, creative and disciplined. Young players who grew up watching him did not merely imitate his moves. They internalized his approach, his understanding that true excellence required competence in every aspect of the game. The relationship between Crosby and the city of Pittsburgh deserves its own chapter in any telling of this story. He arrived in a city that was still mourning the departure of its steel industry, still searching for a new identity. The Penguins were struggling financially, their future uncertain, their arena outdated and half empty on many nights. Crosby did not merely revive the franchise. He helped revive the city's sense of itself. PPG Paints Arena, the state-of-the-art facility that replaced the aging Civic Arena, was built in large part because of the economic impact that Crosby's presence generated. Hotels filled, restaurants thrived, merchandise sold. The ripple effects of his career extended far beyond the ice surface and into the economic and social fabric of the community. There were moments when the relationship was tested. The labor disputes, the lockout of 2012 to 2013, created tension between players and fans that took time to heal. There were seasons of disappointment, early playoff exits, that left the city frustrated and questioning whether the window of opportunity was closing. But through it all, Crosby remained a constant, a figure of stability in a landscape of change. He did not demand trades. He did not publicly criticize his teammates or his coaches. He absorbed the disappointment, processed it privately, and returned each fall with the same intensity that had defined his arrival. The city, in turn, rewarded that loyalty with a devotion that went beyond the typical athlete-fan relationship and became something more personal, more intimate, more enduring. The question of sacrifice is central to understanding Sidney Crosby. What did it cost him to become what he became? The answer is everything that was not hockey. The friendships that were not maintained because he was studying film. The relationships that were not pursued because he was in the gym. The experiences of ordinary young adulthood that were bypassed in favor of an extraordinary but narrow existence. He has never publicly expressed regret about these choices, and perhaps he feels none. But the absence of regret does not mean the absence of cost. Every hour spent perfecting a backhand was an hour not spent doing something else, being someone else, living a life that was broader if less remarkable. His face-off ability was among the most underrated aspects of his game. He approached the dot with the same obsessive preparation that characterized everything else he did, studying opposing centers, identifying tendencies, developing counter-moves for every situation. His face-off percentage consistently ranked among the best in the league, a statistic that seems mundane until you understand its strategic significance. Winning the draw means controlling possession. Controlling possession means controlling the tempo of the game, and controlling the tempo of the game is, in many ways, the single most important factor in determining its outcome. Crosby understood this intuitively, the way a chess player understands the importance of controlling the center of the board. His defensive game evolved significantly over the course of his career. In his early years, he was primarily an offensive force, a player whose value was measured in goals and assists. But as he matured, as the injuries forced him to reconsider his approach, he became one of the most responsible two-way forwards in the game. His back-checking, his positioning in the defensive zone, his ability to read developing plays and disrupt them before they materialized became as much a part of his identity as his ability to score. This evolution was not a concession to age. It was an expansion of his understanding of what it meant to be a complete hockey player. This evolution was not a concession to age or declining ability. It was an expansion of his understanding of what it meant to be truly complete. The greatest players in the history of the game, the ones whose influence persisted long after their retirement, were not merely scorers or playmakers. They were students of the game who understood its rhythms and patterns at a level that bordered on the intuitive. Crosby joined that tradition, not through natural gift alone, but through a willingness to study, to adapt, to reinvent aspects of his game that lesser players would have considered already perfected. The sacrifice was not just physical, it was intellectual and emotional, a constant willingness to confront his own limitations and address them with the same intensity he brought to everything else. His careful and deeply deliberate approach to privacy became a kind of philosophy, a deliberate choice to preserve something essential about himself from the consuming appetite of professional sports culture. In an age when athletes were expected to share every meal, every workout, every personal moment on social media, Crosby maintained boundaries that some found admirable and others found frustrating. He understood instinctively what many public figures learn too late, that the self you perform for the public eventually replaces the self you actually are unless you guard against it with vigilance and intention. Crosby guarded it fiercely, and the cost of that vigilance was a public perception that sometimes mistook his reserve for coldness, his discipline for a lack of personality. When the comprehensive history of hockey in the early 21st century is eventually written, when the scholars and historians and devoted fans sit down to make sense of the era that stretched from the post-lockout rebirth of 2005 through the expansion and evolution of the game in the 2020s, Sidney Crosby will stand at its center, not because he was the most entertaining player of his time, though his creativity on the ice often produced moments of genuine beauty, not because he was the most popular, though he was widely respected across the hockey world and beyond, but because he was the most complete player of his generation, and perhaps of any generation that had come before. He combined offensive creativity with defensive responsibility in a way that few players in the history of the sport had ever managed. He was not simply a goal scorer, though he scored more than 590 goals. He was not simply a playmaker, though he accumulated more than 1,050 assists. He was a player who could dominate a game in every zone, at every speed, in every situation. He could win a face-off in his own end, carry the puck through 3 zones, create a scoring chance, back-check to break up a rush, and win the next face-off, all within the span of a single shift. He was the player that coaches dream about. The player who makes everyone around him better simply by being on the ice. The league that Crosby entered in 2005 was a league in need of rescue. The lockout had alienated a generation of fans. Television ratings had plummeted. The game itself had become defensive and dull, strangled by trapping systems and obstruction that punished skill and rewarded mediocrity. The rule changes that followed the lockout helped. The crackdown on hooking and holding and interference opened the ice and allowed creative players to operate. But rules alone do not revive a sport. A sport needs heroes. It needs faces. It needs stories that compel people to watch and to care. Sidney Crosby was all of those things. He was the living embodiment of the new NHL, a player whose skill and determination represented everything the league wanted to be. His 3 Stanley Cup championships are the foundation of his legacy, but they are not its entirety. His 2 Olympic gold medals, including the golden goal in Vancouver, elevated him beyond the NHL and into the broader landscape of international sport. His consistency, his longevity, his ability to perform at the highest level for 2 decades, despite injuries that would have ended lesser careers, all of these elements contribute to a legacy that is still being shaped even as his playing days wind down. A generation of Canadian children grew up watching Crosby, emulating his style, taping their sticks the way he taped his, practicing their wrist shots in basements and garages the way he had once done in Cole Harbour. Nathan McKinnon, who grew up in the same community and followed a remarkably similar path from Nova Scotia to the NHL, has spoken openly about the profound influence that Crosby had on his development as a player and as a person. Connor McDavid, the player most frequently discussed as Crosby's successor as the best player in the world, has cited Crosby as a formative inspiration. The ripple effects of one career, reaching outward through time, touching players who are only now beginning their own journeys, are part of what makes Crosby's legacy so significant. There is a poignancy in the passing of time that every great athlete must eventually confront, a reckoning with the body's decline that no amount of determination or preparation can fully prevent. The legs that once carried him past defensemen with explosive speed begin to lose a fraction of a step. The hands that once handled the puck with preternatural ease begin to slow by milliseconds that only the player himself can perceive. The mind that once processed the game at a speed that seemed supernatural begins to compensate for what the body can no longer provide. Crosby experienced this gradual, inevitable decline with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire career. He did not rage against it publicly. He did not make excuses. He adapted his game with the intelligence and the work ethic that had always been his greatest assets, relying more on positioning and anticipation as his physical tools diminished, finding ways to contribute and to lead even as the game moved faster and younger around him. What we are losing as Crosby's career enters its final chapters is something that cannot be replicated or replaced. We are losing the last living connection to a particular vision of hockey, a vision in which a single player could carry a franchise on his shoulders, could unite a country with a single goal, could represent an entire sport through the sheer force of his talent and his character. The NHL has grown enormously since Crosby entered the league. It has expanded to 32 teams. It has spread into markets that would have seemed improbable a generation ago. It has become a global business generating billions of dollars in revenue. And in that growth, as in all growth, something has been gained and something has been left behind. Sidney Crosby will one day play his final game. He will skate his final shift. he will leave the ice for the last time and walk down the tunnel into a retirement that will be as quiet and private as the rest of his life outside the arena. And on that day, the sport of hockey will pause, however briefly, to acknowledge what it had and what it is letting go. Not just a player, not just a champion, but a standard, a benchmark, a measuring stick against which every centre who comes after him will be compared and, in all likelihood, found wanting. He was the best of his time. He may have been the best of any time, and the ice will not forget. His influence extends beyond the boundaries of the sport itself. Crosby became a symbol of what it means to be a professional athlete in the 21st century, a model of discipline and commitment and quiet excellence that transcended hockey and resonated with anyone who valued substance over spectacle. In a sporting culture increasingly dominated by social media personas and personal brand management, Crosby's refusal to participate in the machinery of self-promotion was itself a statement, a declaration that the work matters more than the narrative. That performance speaks louder than any post or tweet or carefully staged photograph. The awards and accolades accumulated over his career tell their own story. 2 Hart Memorial Trophies, 2 Art Ross Trophies, 2 Conn Smythe Trophies, a Rocket Richard Trophy, a Mark Messier Leadership Award, multiple All-Star Game selections, multiple selections to the NHL's end-of-season All-Star teams, Olympic gold medals, a World Championship gold medal. These are not merely lines on a resume. They are the evidence of sustained excellence across multiple dimensions of the game. Proof that Crosby was not simply great at one aspect of hockey, but great at all of them, year after year, decade after decade. There is a house in Cole Harbour, Nova Scotia. It sits on a quiet street in a quiet neighbourhood, close enough to the Atlantic to feel the salt wind in the autumn and the bite of frost in the long winter. In the basement of that house, there is a dryer with dents in its surface, souvenirs from a childhood spent in relentless pursuit of a dream that most boys abandon by the time they are 12. There is a wall with marks from 10,000 pucks fired by a boy who did not yet know what he would become but who seemed, even then, to be in a hurry to find out. There is a net worn and sagging from years of service that caught more shots than most goaltenders face in a career. And there is a silence now, the kind of silence that fills a room when the person who once gave it life and noise and purpose has moved on to stages that the room could never contain. Sidney Crosby left that basement a long time ago. He left Cole Harbour. He left Nova Scotia. He crossed provincial borders and national borders and every threshold that the game of hockey could place before him. He played in arenas that held 20,000 people who chanted his name and 20,000 people who booed it. He scored goals that made grown men weep and made children dream and made commentators reach for words that did not exist in the standard vocabulary of sports broadcasting. He lifted a trophy that weighs 35 pounds and carries the weight of a century. He did it 3 times, and each time, in that moment of triumph, with the silver above his head and the ice beneath his skates and the noise of the crowd filling every corner of the arena, he was still, somewhere inside, the boy from the basement, the kid who dented the dryer, the child who loved a game so much that he gave his entire life to it. This is the story of hockey, distilled to its essence. It is the story of small beginnings and impossible dreams. It is the story of frozen ponds and fluorescent lit rinks, of tape and rubber and the sharp metallic hiss of blades cutting through fresh ice. It is the story of boys who grow into men through the discipline of the game, who learn about sacrifice and resilience and the terrible, beautiful truth that greatness demands everything and guarantees nothing. It is the story of communities that build themselves around rinks, of parents who drive through snowstorms at 5 a.m. because their children have a practice that cannot be missed, of coaches who volunteer their time because they believe that the game teaches lessons that no classroom can provide. There will be other great players. The game ensures it. The cycle of development, from frozen pond to minor hockey to junior leagues to the NHL, produces talent with a regularity that borders on the miraculous. There will be other champions. The Stanley Cup demands it, offering itself each spring to whoever can survive the ordeal of the playoffs and earn the right to lift it. There will be other kids from small towns who pick up sticks for the first time and feel something click inside them. some recognition that this is what they were meant to do, and who begin the long, uncertain, glorious journey toward the highest levels of the sport. Some of them will make it, most will not. The mathematics of professional hockey are merciless, but all of them, whether they know it or not, will be walking a path that Sidney Crosby helped illuminate. He showed them what was possible. He showed them what it cost. And he showed them that the cost, however steep, however painful, however permanent, was worth paying. The game goes on. It always does. The ice is resurfaced. The lines are painted fresh. The puck is dropped at center ice. New rivalries begin and old ones recede into memory and legend. New names are engraved on the cup each June, and old names are retired to the bands stored in the vault at the Hockey Hall of Fame, preserved but no longer visible, remembered by the historians and the devoted fans who keep the records and tell the stories. The cycle continues, relentless and beautiful, season after season, generation after generation, an unbroken chain of ice and effort and desire that stretches back more than a century and forward into a future that no one can predict. But some names carry more weight than others. Some names stop you when you see them engraved in silver, make you pause, make you remember. Gretzky, Lemieux, Orr, Howe, Richard, Béliveau, and now, etched alongside them in the permanent record of the game, the name of a boy from a modest house on a quiet street in a quiet town on the edge of the Atlantic, a boy who dented a dryer and changed a sport. Sidney Crosby, the kid who became the king of his era, and the king who never once forgot that he was just a kid from Cole Harbour who loved hockey more than anything else in the world. The measure of an athlete's greatness is not found solely in the records he sets or the trophies he wins. It is found in the way he changes the expectations of those who watch him play. Before Crosby, a centre who scored 80 points and played responsible defence was considered excellent. After Crosby, that same performance felt ordinary, because he had shown everyone what was truly possible when talent and effort and intelligence converged in a single player. He raised the bar not just for himself but for the entire sport, and the bar, once raised, does not come down. The basement in Cole Harbour has been renovated now. The dents in the dryer have been smoothed out, the scars on the drywall repaired, but the memory persists, as memories do in small towns, passed from one generation to the next like an heirloom that grows more valuable with each telling. The parents who watched the boy with the oversized gloves now bring their grandchildren to the rink, pointing to the banners and the photographs, and saying, with quiet pride, that they knew him when. They remember the sound of the puck hitting the dryer door in the early morning hours. They remember the boy who never stopped. They remember the sound of dreams being built, one shot at a time, in the cold Nova Scotia dark. The ice in Cole Harbour still freezes each winter. The ponds still call to children who lace up their skates and dream their dreams in the bitter cold. And somewhere among them, there may be another child whose talent burns brighter than the rest, whose dedication exceeds what anyone around them can fully comprehend. That child will not be Sidney Crosby. No one will be Sidney Crosby. But the path he carved, from that basement to the pinnacle of hockey, remains visible, a trail through the wilderness that others can follow even if they cannot replicate the journey exactly.